What if a prophet stood up, said exactly the right thing, and the only record we have of him is 4 verses describing how he was hunted down, dragged back from another country, and thrown into a common grave? No oracles, no book, no legacy, just a name, a hometown, and a death. That is the entire biblical footprint of Uriah, son of Shemaiah. And I think that makes him one of the most haunting figures in the whole Old Testament. To understand why Uriah matters, you need to feel the political pressure of his moment. It is somewhere around 609 to 605 BCE. King Josiah, the great reformer of Judah, has just died at Megiddo fighting Pharaoh Necho II. His reform movement, his centralizing of worship in Jerusalem, the whole project he gave his life to, has died with him. Pharaoh Necho installs a new king, Jehoiakim, and Judah is now a client state of Egypt. The atmosphere in Jerusalem is tense, paranoid, and deeply uncertain. Jehoiakim is not a popular king. He was not chosen by the people. He was installed by a foreign power, and he rules accordingly. 2 Kings and Jeremiah both paint him as someone who taxes his subjects heavily to pay tribute to Egypt, who burns scroll sections he finds politically inconvenient, and who has a very low tolerance for prophets telling him his kingdom is on a collision course with judgment. He is the kind of ruler who treats inconvenient truth as a security threat. Into this environment steps Jeremiah. Most of us know the broad strokes. He delivers what scholars call the Temple Sermon, recorded in Jeremiah 7 and retold from a different angle in Jeremiah 26. He stands at the entrance of the temple and tells the people that if they do not change course, God will make this house like Shiloh, meaning completely destroyed. The priests and the prophets who supported the temple establishment are furious. They call for his death. That is the main storyline of Jeremiah 26. But here is what most people miss when they read Jeremiah 26. Right in the middle of this chapter, almost as a parenthetical aside, the text introduces someone else entirely. Verses 20 through 23 step back from Jeremiah's story and say, by the way, there was another man doing the same thing at the same time. His name was Uriah, son of Shemaiah, from Kiriath Jearim. And unlike Jeremiah, who survived this crisis, Uriah did not. The text uses his story as a kind of dark contrast, a shadow version of the Jeremiah episode. Let's read the actual passage, because it is worth sitting with every word. Jeremiah 26:20 through 23 in the NRSV reads, "There was another man prophesying in the name of the Lord, Uriah son of Shemaiah from Kiriath Jearim. He prophesied against this city and against this land in words exactly like those of Jeremiah. And when King Jehoiakim, with all his warriors and all the officials, heard his words, the king sought to put him to death." 4 verses. That is the whole story. And yet every detail is loaded. Start with the name. Uriah in Hebrew is transliterated as Uriah, and it carries the meaning, YHWH is my light. That is not a neutral name in the ancient world. Names in the Hebrew Bible are often theological statements, either about the parent's faith or about the person's identity. His father is Shemaiah, which means YHWH has heard. This is a family whose naming conventions are saturated with trust in the God of Israel. Before we know a single thing Uriah said, his name tells us whose side he believed he was on. His hometown is Kiriath Jearim, and this detail is more significant than it sounds. If you know your Old Testament geography, you know Kiriath Jearim from 1 Samuel 7, where the Ark of the Covenant rested for 20 years after being returned by the Philistines. It sits about 12 to 13 kilometers west of Jerusalem in the hill country. Recent excavations led by Israel Finkelstein and Thomas Romer between 2017 and 2019 uncovered a monumental Iron Age platform there, suggesting this was a serious cultic and administrative center in the late monarchic period. So Uriah is not some peripheral figure from an insignificant backwater. He comes from a place that had deep connections to Israel's most sacred object and that functioned as a regional religious hub. When the text says he came from Kiriath Jearim, the original audience would have heard that and understood that this was a man with roots in serious Yahwistic tradition. He is not a fringe voice. He is someone embedded in the same religious world that produced the prophets we still read today. Now look at what the text says about his message. He prophesied against this city and against this land in words exactly like those of Jeremiah. That phrase is remarkable. The biblical author is not saying Uriah was imitating Jeremiah or borrowing from him. The text presents them as independent voices delivering the same essential verdict. Scholars like Jack Lundbaum in his Anchor Yale Bible commentary on Jeremiah point out that this suggests the judgment against Jerusalem message was not a solo performance. It was part of a broader prophetic current flowing through this period. This is one of those moments where the text quietly dismantles a popular assumption. We tend to read Jeremiah as a lone dissenter, the weeping prophet standing against everyone, the isolated voice crying in the wilderness. And that image is not entirely wrong. But Uriah's existence complicates it in an important way. There were other people saying similar things. Some of them did not survive. The loneliness we associate with Jeremiah may have less to do with him being the only one who saw clearly and more to do with the fact that he was one of the few who lived to tell about it. When Jehoiakim hears what Uriah is saying, the king moves fast. The text says he and his officials sought to put Uriah to death. That phrase in the Hebrew carries urgency. This is not a slow bureaucratic process. This is a king who feels his authority directly threatened by a man preaching that the city and the temple are going to be destroyed. In a political climate where Judah is already under Egyptian pressure and the population is anxious about the future, a prophet declaring divine judgment is not just a theological nuisance. He is a potential catalyst for unrest. Here is where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely fascinating. Uriah hears about the death threat, and he does something that no other biblical prophet in a comparable situation does quite so explicitly. He runs. Verse 21 says he was afraid and fled, and he went to Egypt. Now, before you judge him for that, sit with it for a moment. The text does not condemn him for fleeing. It simply records it. Fear is a human response, and Egypt, at this particular moment in history, makes a certain kind of strategic sense as a destination. Think about the geopolitics here. In the early years of Jehoiakim's reign, Judah is an Egyptian client state. Pharaoh Necho II is the power behind the throne. If you are a Judean dissident fleeing royal persecution, Egypt might seem like a reasonable refuge. It is the dominant regional power. It is where Jehoiakim's own political legitimacy comes from. Maybe Uriah thought he could find protection there, or at least distance. It is the kind of calculation a frightened but intelligent man might make when the king's soldiers are asking questions about his whereabouts. But the calculation fails. And this is the part of the story that most surprises people when they read it carefully. Jehoiakim does not just let Uriah go. He sends a delegation to Egypt specifically to bring him back. The text names the leader of this delegation, Elnathan, son of Achbor. That name is not random. Elnathan appears elsewhere in Jeremiah 36, where he is one of the officials who urges King Jehoiakim not to burn Jeremiah's scroll. He is a named figure in the court, someone with enough authority to conduct an international retrieval operation. Egypt hands him over. That is the brutal simplicity of verse 22 and 23. They bring Uriah out of Egypt and take him to King Jehoiakim. Now think about what that means structurally. Egypt is not protecting a Judean dissident against his own king. Egypt is cooperating with Jehoiakim. And that fits perfectly with the historical reality of this early period. Judah is a subordinate state. Uriah is, from Egypt's perspective, a political troublemaker belonging to a client kingdom. Handing him back is not a betrayal. It is just maintaining order in a vassal relationship. There's a painful irony here that the text does not underline, but that I think is worth naming. Later in Jeremiah, specifically chapters 42 through 44, a group of Judeans flee to Egypt after the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BCE, seeking safety. Jeremiah himself is taken along against his will. Egypt as a refuge is a recurring theme in the book. But for Uriah, Egypt is the place where the long arm of Jehoiakim reaches him. The geography of safety and danger is not fixed. It shifts depending on who is in power and what deals have been made. Jehoiakim kills him with the sword. The text is blunt about this. It does not say executed or punished. The Hebrew is direct. He struck him down with the sword. This is almost certainly a royal execution, the kind of death reserved for someone the king has personally decided is a threat. We do not have a trial. We do not have a hearing. We do not have any record of Uriah being given a chance to defend himself or recant his message. He is brought back and he is killed. The whole process, from extradition to execution, is described in a single verse. And then comes the final detail, the one that I think is the most theologically loaded line in the whole passage. Jehoiakim throws his dead body into the burial place of the common people. In the ancient Near Eastern world, burial mattered enormously. Where you were buried, how you were buried, and with whom you were buried were all markers of your status, your honor, and your place in the community. A proper burial was a final act of dignity. Being thrown into a common grave was a statement. It was the king saying, "This man deserves no honor, no memory, no monument." Contrast this with what happens to Jeremiah in the same chapter. Jeremiah 26 ends with Jeremiah being protected by Ahikam, son of Shaphan, a court official who shields him from the crowd calling for his execution. Jeremiah lives. He goes on to prophesy for decades. His words are recorded, preserved, compiled into one of the longest books in the Hebrew Bible. Uriah gets a common grave and 4 verses. The contrast is not accidental. The biblical author is making a point about survival, about patronage, and about which voices get preserved by history. This raises a question that I think is worth sitting with as a serious reader of the text. How many Uriahs were there? How many prophets spoke, were silenced, and left no trace except maybe a passing reference in someone else's story? The Dead Sea Scrolls give us texts that were not included in the canon. Scholars working on Second Temple Judaism have documented traditions about figures who were remembered in some communities and forgotten in others. The canon we have is not the totality of what was said. It is what survived the process of preservation, and that process was not neutral. Here is the detail that I find most haunting about Uriah as a literary and theological figure. We have none of his words, not a single oracle. not a fragment of a prophecy. We know he spoke against the city and the land in words like those of Jeremiah, but we do not know exactly what he said. We have the container, the narrative about his death, but the contents are completely gone. In biblical scholarship, there is a term for figures who are defined by their absence. Uriah is almost a negative space. We see the shape of him only because the text describes what happened to him, not what he said. Some biblical scholars have speculated about whether Uriah's words might have been deliberately suppressed, whether the same royal power that executed him also made sure his oracles did not circulate. That is speculative, and I want to be honest that it is speculative. We cannot prove that. But it is not an unreasonable inference given what we know about how ancient Near Eastern rulers handled dissent. Burning scrolls was not a metaphor. Jeremiah 36 tells us that Jehoiakim literally cut up and burned a scroll of Jeremiah's prophecies. A king willing to do that is a king capable of erasing a record. Let's talk about the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE. Because it changes everything about the context surrounding Uriah's death. Before Carchemish, Egypt is the dominant power in the Levant. Jehoiakim is an Egyptian client. The extradition of Uriah from Egypt makes perfect sense in that framework. After Carchemish, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II crushes Egypt's forces, and the geopolitical map of the ancient Near East is redrawn in a single afternoon. Judah shifts from Egyptian to Babylonian orbit. The world that made Uriah's story possible disappears within a few years of his death. Uriah's story is therefore squeezed into an extraordinarily compressed and volatile window of history. He is active during the transition from Egyptian to Babylonian dominance, during the reign of a king who was himself a foreign imposition, during a moment when the prophetic tradition was under severe pressure. Preaching judgment against Jerusalem in that environment was not just theologically controversial, it was politically dangerous in a way that is hard to overstate. You were essentially saying the current order, which the king's legitimacy depended on, was going to collapse. I want to address the comparison between Uriah and Jeremiah directly because the text invites it and because I think it is often misread. Some readers have interpreted the contrast as a judgment on Uriah's faith, as if Jeremiah's survival proves he trusted God more, and Uriah's death proves he did not. I do not think that is what the text is doing. The text does not condemn Uriah for fleeing. It does not say his death was a punishment. It presents his fate as a consequence of political power operating without restraint. The difference between the two men is not faithfulness. It is access to protection. Elnathan, son of Akbor, is worth one more moment of attention. Here is a man who leads the extradition mission that results in Uriah's death, and yet in Jeremiah 36, he is one of the officials who tells the king not to burn Jeremiah's scroll. He seems to occupy a morally complicated middle position, someone embedded in the royal court who is capable of acts of restraint, but also capable of carrying out orders that lead to a prophet's death. He is a reminder that the people surrounding power in ancient Judah were not simply villains or heroes. They were people navigating impossible situations. There is something in Uriah's story that I think speaks directly to the experience of reading the Bible carefully and honestly. The canon preserves him, but barely. He gets 4 verses and a common grave. His words are gone. His story ends before it really begins. And yet the fact that he is there at all, that someone thought it was worth including this brief account of a man who preached, fled, was captured, and died tells us something important. The people who assembled the book of Jeremiah thought Uriah's existence mattered enough to record. Even if they could not save him, they saved his name. If you are the kind of reader who has spent time with the prophetic books and found yourself wondering about all the voices that did not make it into the text, Uriah is your entry point into that question. He represents every prophet who spoke truthfully, suffered for it, and left no book behind. He is the prophet whose message we will never read, whose oracles we cannot study, whose theological contribution we can only infer from the fact that the king found it threatening enough to pursue him across an international border. His absence is itself a kind of testimony. What I keep coming back to is the burial. Jehoiakim throws him into the burial place of the common people. In one reading, this is pure humiliation, the king's final word on the matter. But in another reading, and this is not a forced interpretation, it places Uriah among the ordinary people he was speaking for. The prophets who preached judgment against Jerusalem were not doing it because they hated the city. They were doing it because they believed the city's leadership had abandoned the people. Ending up in a common grave is, in a strange way, a fitting conclusion for a man who stood with the common people against power. If this episode has done what I hope it has done, you are walking away with a sharper sense of what the prophetic tradition in ancient Judah actually looked like. It was not a clean succession of major and minor prophets neatly archived in the canon. It was a contested, dangerous, politically entangled world where speaking truthfully could get you killed, and where survival often depended on factors that had nothing to do with the quality of your message. Uriah, son of Shemaiah, preached the truth as he understood it, and it cost him everything. That is worth remembering. If you found Uriah worth your time, there are more figures like him in this channel. People who appear for a verse or two, carry names nobody pronounces, and then vanish from the story. I dig into each one carefully because I believe every name in that ancient text is pointing towards something worth understanding. Subscribe if that kind of careful, unhurried reading is what you are looking for. And if you have a figure you want me to look into, leave the name in the comments. I read every one of them, and some of the best episodes on this channel started exactly there.